Longer freight trains have become a common theme in the modern days of railroading. When watching a train in the 2020s, it's not uncommon to see multiple engines pushing from the middle, and much more of the train right behind them. For better or worse, trains up to 2, 3, or even more miles in length can be found across North America and other parts of the world. These trains carry hundreds of cars worth of goods, but while that may be great for the railroads and their shippers, it's also met with large amounts of controversy. As these long trains have become a daily occurrence, they've also become rather excessive and have been frequently considered a dangerous, greedy way to make some quick profits. However, while monster trains are associated mostly with the current age of railroading, the roots of making a massive train date decades, even centuries back in history. In 1967, Norfolk and Western ran several large coal trains in West Virginia and Ohio. The biggest of these was 4 miles, and set a world record for the longest freight train, which stood for over 20 years. Just 7 years prior, in 1960, N&W retired the last of their steam locomotives, as the final American Class I railroad to regularly operate steam. The steam era is a point in time that most think fondly of. It was a time that was considered simpler in many ways. And even in railroading's golden age, making a train longer was not an obscure idea. Because in 1897, when railroads in the nation were still in their boom years, the steam era's own mega train would grace American rails. 3 years earlier, in 1894, a salt company began production in western New York. Like every business, this company, Worcester Salt, relied on the railroads to deliver its goods. 2 railroads in particular, the Erie and the New York, New Haven, and Hartford, shipped much of the salt produced by Worcester in the town of Silver Springs to points east in the New England area, hundreds of miles away. Most of these trains were nothing unusual, being about the average length for freight trains at the time. That is, only about a few dozen cars long, measuring several thousand feet at the most. But as the year 1896 came to a close, in an attempt to stand out and make a name for itself, Worcester Salt decided to try something new with the help of the railroads. At the beginning of 1897, the companies would create a publicity stunt of sorts. What they came up with was a massive freight train unlike any other at the time, one that measured nearly 1.5 miles long, close to 8,000 feet. During the late 19th century, there were a handful of accounts of other railroads, such as the Lehigh Valley, running trains of similar length. But this train would be one recorded throughout the Northeast, one recognized by the news and even the country's president. At 7 o'clock on January 6th, using an electrical network built specifically for the occasion, President William McKinley pressed a button from Canton, Ohio, to start the 162-car train, deemed the Worcester Salt Special, on its way east. At least 5 steam locomotives were distributed throughout the train, which held over 5 million pounds of salt, approximately 2,700 tons, loaded in 14,000 barrels and more than 10,000 sacks. The orange wooden boxcars that carried this load were all specially decorated with banners, and a passenger car coupled to one section of the train carried Worcester Salt executives as well as members of the press. The massive shipment traveled mostly through daylight and passed through towns across southern New York and northeastern Pennsylvania before it interchanged with the New Haven. From there, the salt was delivered to numerous firms over both rail lines in communities such as Boston and Jersey City, where it was distributed accordingly to consumers in the area. For those involved, the train was an overall success. It received positive publicity from crowds that watched its departure, and the media which covered the special, which went down as the biggest single shipment by rail for its time, a position it would keep for many years. Although other publicity stunts on large scales were performed by railroads in the following century, the Worcester Salt Special would be the only recorded train of its size for decades to come, before it was topped by the next recognized record breaker, Norfolk and Western's coal trains, 70 years later. By then, much had changed in American industries. Years before, in 1943, having been a railroad customer for several decades, Worcester Salt was acquired by the Morton Salt Company, which continues to produce table salt for kitchens everywhere. Erie and New Haven both went on to merge into Erie-Lackawanna and Penn Central respectively, before both became part of Conrail in 1976. Today, the former Erie route is operated by Norfolk Southern between Buffalo and Binghamton, and still passes through Silver Springs. Meanwhile, New Haven's trackage is used mostly by CSX and Amtrak as part of the bustling Northeast Corridor. Both freight railroads, along with every other Class 1, now run freight trains reaching and exceeding 8,000 feet on a daily basis. For a measurement that seemed gargantuan in the 1890s, it has now become more or less the norm. While back then, a train bigger than the rest was treated with wonder, excitement, and optimism, the megatrains of today are viewed with negativity more than anything else. Sure, these current trains are literal miles ahead of the Worcester Salt Special. And sure, these trains have become a common, overused cite, rather than the rare exception. But even so, the railroads of old showed how a large-sized train can still be a benefit. At a time when the number of American Class 1 railroads was in the triple digits, when train travel was at its peak, and when friction bearings were still regularly used. Even in those days, the concept of a longer train was proven to have some good, not just to the businessmen behind its creation, but to the numerous cities it served across the country. Everyone can agree that long trains are far from perfect, but flawed as they are, they still have a purpose somewhere in the railroad world. After all, they had a place all the way back in 1897.